Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. The University of Alberta is among the world's top 10 producers of energy systems research and is home to Canada's largest energy systems research and teaching network. Building on the U of A's century-long history in energy and environment research and teaching, we aim to spark new ways of thinking about energy systems while leading collaborations and partnerships that will inspire and inform the global community's energy transitions. Future Energy Systems is the primary research program in the energy systems signature area and is funded by a $75 million grant from the Canada First Research Excellence Fund. Energy research today must encompass a full range of approaches, from the sustainable development of both fossil fuels and renewables, to understanding and measuring climate change and devising pollution controls, to reclaiming and improving land and water use and rethinking environmental law and policy, and much more. With more than 500 experts from across 18 faculties, the U of A is applying an interdisciplinary lens to the study of energy systems. Today, we're here to talk about energy and sustainability in our communities. Our three speakers will share their research that explores the interface of new energy technologies and our everyday lives, and how these approaches to energy in our communities can promote sustainability throughout our society. Each speaker is going to get about 10 minutes, and then at the end, we'll all be available to answer questions and have a discussion. So we're going to get right into it because we want to have a good discussion at the end. So how the questions are going to work is you can put them in the chat box. If you do want to pop up on screen or ask them verbally, you can. We are recording this event and it will be going up on YouTube. So if you don't want to be on camera, make sure you just type in your question. So our first speaker is Dr. Neelakshi Joshi. She's a social scientist, urban planner, and architect interested in the social dimension of sustainability. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow focusing on municipal transitions to low carbon pathways in Canada. So I'd like to welcome Neelakshi up on the screen to present her research.
Okay. So thank you for that introduction once again. And I'm happy to be part of this group today, presenting a part of our research which deals with community-led actions on energy transition. The title of my talk today is Something Old, Something New, and Something Green: Community Leagues and Neighborhood Energy Transitions in Edmonton. But before I unpack that very long title, let's take a minute to step back and reflect on some of the reasons why we are here today. So global warming, climate change, greenhouse gas reduction, and energy transitions are identified as the defining problems of our generation. And given their scale and magnitude, it is often that we hear of international, national, provincial, and city level efforts to tackle these issues. However, there is a growing momentum to understand and promote community-led action, or people taking action on these issues and acting in a bottom-up manner. One example of community-led action is the work of community-based grassroots organizations that address sustainability. Although there are multiple definitions of what a community-based organization is, for the sake of this presentation, I would like to define them as innovative networks of activists and organizations that lead bottom-up solutions for sustainable development. Edmonton is full of such examples. For maybe you've heard of the Local Good, who organize Green Drinks event, Bike Edmonton that promotes active mobility, or the Fridays for Future chapter of Edmonton. So while these organizations are playing an important role in promoting bottom-up sustainability, they do run into certain challenges, or literature defines certain challenges that such organizations face, and they are typically categorized into two sections. So intrinsic challenges and diffusion challenges. Intrinsic challenges are related to the very nature of these organizations. They're almost like new startups taking on a new idea, and they run into problems like volunteer burnouts or cuts in funding that threat their very existence. and hence making them short-lived efforts to address the challenge of sustainability, leaving little institutional memory behind. Some diffusion challenges that they face, and this is much linked to the intrinsic challenges, are the problems of scaling up, of engaging a critical mass of citizens, and ultimately influencing governments to take those larger actions. And during our research, we realized that a lot of these issues were sort of linked with the newness of these organizations. They were all new efforts that were taking place. And that led us to question what happens when established grassroots organizations with long histories in their local communities adapt and adopt the ideas of energy transition. And this leads me back to my title, which is something old, so a very well-established community organization. Think of your school or think of a social group within a religious organization in your neighborhood, or your sports club, which you are a part of, or your parents have been a part of. So very well-established community organizations. What happens when they take up new ideas, and in this case, green ideas of promoting sustainability? Edmonton, of course, provides a very fertile ground to study this because for those of you who probably grew up in Edmonton, that symbol might be familiar. It represents the Edmonton Federation of Community Leagues, which is an umbrella organization for 161 neighborhood organizations called community leagues and promote various activities in their neighborhoods that include sports and recreation. Following an interest in the community, certain pioneer leagues partnered with EFCL and the city of Edmonton to start a program called Green Leagues with the idea of promoting sustainability at the neighborhood level. Two of their signature programs were promoting energy retrofits and transition to renewable energy for community buildings. So based on our discussion and talks with 10 such neighborhoods in Edmonton who took these first steps with the help of the Green Leagues program, and a review of their documents, as well as a survey of residents in these neighborhoods, we tried to understand what were the challenges, or how different was this for established organizations like community leagues to take up the challenges of sustainability. So on one hand, we found that positioning organizations or positioning ideas of energy transition within such organizations does have some intrinsic opportunities and diffusion opportunities, because being a part of a larger structure or a well-established structure provides an existing organizational structure. It provides an existing community presence, which many new grassroots organizations struggle with. It also provides diffusion opportunities because leagues have access to neighborhoods, and they hold the trust and familiarity within their community, which are very important things if you need to diffuse or promote an idea. However, we also found out that positioning such green niches within existing structures did come with a certain number of challenges. Again, classifying them as intrinsic and diffusion challenges. So establishing sustainability as a new object within an existing organization structure, which was known traditionally for other roles, for probably promoting recreation, for promoting social activities, suddenly had to take the new role of promoting sustainability, which did not come so naturally to many leagues. There was also limited volunteer time and energy that could be put into such activities, because it is a completely volunteer-driven effort. Similarly, diffusion challenges, people sometimes did not associate leagues with the ideas of sustainability and energy transition. So for example, although a social evening would be very well visited, an event organized by the sustainability manager would have only a limited number of people visiting it. And finally, again, to make these ideas popular, you need a lot of volunteer time and energy, which was at premium. So leagues that were unable to mobilize a large number of volunteers to promote the ideas ran into problems of diffusing them further. Based on a residence survey in these neighborhoods, we had interesting mix of results. So in general, within the neighborhoods or the survey residents that survey participants mentioned that there was a large interest in these ideas, in the ideas of energy transition, in the ideas of renewable energy. People were aware of what the League was doing, or mildly aware of what the League was doing on these issues. And out of the 75 participants, 69% mentioned that they had in some form transitioned themselves, so either installed a solar panel or conducted energy retrofits and so on. On the other hand, however, we had mixed results when we asked participants on the League's role in influencing their energy transition decisions. And here we found that only 8% said that the League played a very important role in making them transition. And then 41% had done so through other means. So in fairness to the Green League's program, the program is relatively new, and it does take time for such programs to gain visibility and gain mobility in their leagues. So just based on talking to residents and on talking to participants of this program, we found that community-led action is definitely integral in facing the existential problems of our times. Established community structures are fertile sites for embedding such niches. They provide these intrinsic opportunities. However, these intrinsic opportunities are also coupled with intrinsic challenges that the organization must overcome. So with that, I would like to end. And for those of you who are interested in this topic and who are active promoters of community-led action, the writing on the wall is clear, at least on the Berlin Wall is clear. It says that many small people who in many small places do many small things can alter the face of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neelakshi. And if you're interested in hearing more about what Neelakshi does, she'll be doing a full-length talk with the Edmonton Public Library in November. I'll put those details in the chat. So I'd like to invite our next speaker, Andrea Miller. She is a master's student in rural and environmental sociology. Her current research is focused on a just transition and opportunities for Indigenous communities to develop renewable energy. So Andrea, you can hop up on screen and start sharing.
So hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Miller. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology. I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 here in so-called Edmonton. Thank you, Dr. Wilson and Valerie, for those introductions. And thank you to the Sustainability Council for having us. Today, I'll be sharing some of my graduate research on community energy and Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects here in Alberta. So I think community energy is a concept that is particularly relevant to the theme of our session today. And to our changing relationship with energy. So community-owned renewable energy projects invite us to rethink our position within the energy system and to start to see ourselves and our communities as generators of energy rather than just energy consumers. I want to invite you to just reflect for a moment on who makes up your community, or more likely communities. We can define community in a number of ways, right? And in a number of scales. We just heard Neelakshi talk about renewables at the community league level. But community energy projects can locate and be owned by rural and urban municipalities, by Indigenous communities, and other communities who are brought together by a shared connection to place or by a shared interest in these projects. In community energy projects, community members act as project planners, managers, often owners, and beneficiaries. The planning and decision-making processes are open and collaborative. Shared interest in a project ensures that there is a level of trust between parties and that the benefits of these projects are accrued in the local community. And local place-based knowledge is really considered an asset so that these projects do reflect community interests and goals. So this is a map that was developed by my colleagues, some of whom are on the call this morning, and it shows all of the renewable energy projects over 1 megawatt that are currently operational or in development. But the projects on the second map are only those projects with some degree of community ownership. So what we can learn from the difference between these two maps is that the way our current energy transition is unfolding is still very much one where private companies and provincial utilities own and operate renewable energy infrastructure. Meeting our renewable electricity targets will require transitions happening at all scales, particularly at the community level, if we don't want to replicate the way that our current energy system is operating. And in this democratization of energy, community energy projects uphold principles of justice and of equity. These projects are part of an energy transition that is not dominated by private energy actors, where communities are disconnected from their energy system, but rather one that centers community experience. And this can be a just transition. A just transition invites us to consider who benefits from the transition and who is harmed, and how we can realize an energy transition that does not perpetuate those harms that have been carried out by our current energy system. And in Canada, a just transition is one that upholds the commitments and the relationships made in the treaties and in calls to action outlined in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. These are particularly relevant, particularly the 92nd call to action, which is outlined here, which calls for a basis of free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before moving forward with any economic development projects. And it calls for Indigenous communities to be the long-term beneficiaries of these projects through equitable access to jobs, training, and other opportunities. So this highlights the need for the community-centric and culturally relevant energy planning that community energy can offer. And we see Indigenous communities already being uniquely positioned to take a leadership role in the just transition. You may be familiar with some of these projects, as Indigenous nations are increasingly developing community-owned renewable energy projects across the country. These examples are just some of the ownership models that exist, and it illustrates the diversity of ways in which communities are moving forward with developing renewable energy projects. And just as each project and community is unique, so are the motivations and the challenges behind each project. So my research aims to explore those opportunities and those barriers of Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects in Alberta. I ask, what role do Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects play in the just transition? And how can project ownership support further involvement and control of Indigenous communities in the growing renewable energy sector? This project and my research has its foundations in community-based participatory research. Over the last year and a half, I've developed a relationship with Enoch Cree Nation, and together with my community research partner, Laurel Ward, who is a U of A student and a really active member of the Enoch Youth Council, we spoke with a number of community members who shared with us their views on the environment, climate change, and the possibilities for renewable energy in their community. I also had a number of conversations with clean energy leaders from other Indigenous communities and governance bodies, municipal administration, energy advisors, solar installers, and research and advocacy groups. So altogether, we have 24 narratives that can begin to paint the picture of the current landscape of Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects in Alberta right now. So what are we learning from these conversations so far? We've just finished with interviews. So here are some of the quotes from those conversations and some of the takeaways that I want to leave you with this morning. So for some communities, ownership, majority ownership, is a necessity. It's a non-negotiable, particularly when those projects locate on reserve. Community-owned projects are connected to local knowledge of place, and they position community members as the experts on how to move forward with energy development and energy decision-making in their own communities. And these projects are important because they align with the policy directives that have been outlined in the TRC and in UNDRIP that call for long-term opportunities and benefits. And what this looks like is not just communities having a seat at the decision-making table about projects that may affect them, but actually initiating the projects and being involved in all phases of the projects so that they do receive those long-term benefits and that the project ultimately reflects local interests. I do want to stress that, of course, there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and that for other communities, ownership may look different. Ownership does mean taking on a certain degree of risk if something were to go wrong. So sometimes a minority ownership stake can be a catalyst to begin generating revenue, to invest back into the nation, and to potentially secure that majority ownership stake for the next project. What is critical throughout is not only this mechanism of equity ownership stake, but having a sense of ownership over the project. And this comes with community buy-in, community engagement, and pride in the project. So what we often see are communities taking incremental steps towards their own transitions in their own communities and on their own terms. And it doesn't always look like a solar farm or a wind turbine. Under this broader umbrella of community energy, we see community energy planning, energy audits, energy efficiency retrofitting, feasibility studies, all taking place within communities. And so, as beneficial as these singular projects are, the transition will really require us to look beyond the local level and to look for ways to scale these projects and their benefits, perhaps across multiple communities or multiple treaty regions, while still retaining those core principles of community energy. Ultimately, the success of these projects requires political will, and it also requires actions from those private energy actors who are contributing most to our climate crisis to make real commitments to support justice in our energy transition. Thank you, everyone. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was a wonderful talk. So I'm now going to invite our final speaker to come on. Mohammed Saad Arshad is a mechanical engineering graduate and currently pursuing his master's in engineering management. He was a sustainability scholar in 2019, and his research focuses on energy storage technologies. So welcome.
Thank you, Valerie, for your kind introduction. As Valerie mentioned, that I was a sustainability scholar in 2019. So basically, I worked with the city of Edmonton, and I worked on the electric bus project for their electrification using a specific technology called flywheel energy storage system. I'll be explaining another case study with you today. So I'll be sharing my screen. Okay, so today I'll be talking about the electrification of communities using the same flywheel energy storage system that was proposed for the charging of electric buses to the city of Edmonton. So as Valerie mentioned, I am a graduate student in the Department of Mechanical Engineering under the supervision of Dr. Pierre Martini. So what motivates us to use this technology for the standalone microgrid? So first of all, we want to utilize the renewable energy resources as much as possible, and utilizing the renewable energy resources will eventually decrease the greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, if we are using the standalone microgrid, we are assuming that it is not connected to the grid. And so we are basically saving the grid expansion cost. And last but not the least, we'll be using the environment-friendly storage technology, which is the flywheel energy storage system that I mentioned. I'll be getting into details of the flywheel energy storage system in the next slide. So what is basically a flywheel energy storage system? Sometimes it is referred to as a mechanical batteries. You are all aware of the batteries that normally are chemical based. So this is a picture of a flywheel energy storage system that was manufactured in our ACME lab. And here is the cross-sectional view of it. So the main component of a flywheel is a rotating mass, which you can see right here, which is also called a rotor. Right. So what happens is that this rotor rotates in a vacuum. So whenever the electrical energy is input via this integrated motor generator unit, this rotating mass rotates very high speeds and storing energy in the form of kinetic energy. That's why we call it as a mechanical battery. And whenever, of course, you need the electrical energy back, so you use the same kinetic energy and the same motor generator unit and get the electrical energy out of it. So these are the main components: the rotor, which rotates in the vacuum housing, which is levitated on the bearing system and connected to the electric machine, which is the motor generator unit. So as I mentioned, the flywheels are the mechanical batteries and the other batteries are the chemical batteries. So what is the difference between both of them? So what are the pros and cons of both the technologies? So the flywheels have really high power charging capabilities. So the flywheels can supply very high power for the short amount of time. Hence, flywheels are also referred to as you store energy for a very short amount of time, but the batteries can store energy for a bit high amount of time. And so they have high energy storage capabilities, although that technology is evolving for the flywheels, and we have moved toward the flywheels that have composite rotors. Initially, they used to be the steel ones. So eventually the energy storage capabilities are also increasing. The advantage of the flywheel is that it has almost infinite charge and discharge cycles. So well, in case of chemical batteries, the charging cycles and the discharging cycles are very limited, and eventually at the end of the day, after certain amount of cycles, you have to change the batteries. But for the flywheel, it takes very high amount of charge and discharge cycle until when you have to replace them. The other advantage of the flywheels is that they require little to no maintenance. While pretty much high maintenance is required in terms of batteries, let it be lead acid or let it be lithium-ion battery. Okay, so since I mentioned that we'll be using this technology for the electrification of remote communities that are dependent on islanded microgrids. So this is an example this is an architecture of the microgrid that was considered. So before I proceed, I just want to mention that this was performed in a National Renewable Energy Laboratory software, Homer Pro. And so for the sake of this simulation, we use a genset as a backup energy storage system. And of course, we want to use a genset as much lesser as possible because we want to be more dependent on the renewable energy. And we are using solar PV in that. And just to mention that according to International Energy Agency, the cost to build per megawatt of solar plant has become low as compared to the fossil fuels around the globe. We'll also be using the flywheel, and we'll also be using the lithium-ion battery. So we'll see in the coming slides that how how different scenarios will work and what would be the best scenario that has the less cost and that has the most sustainable solution. So this electric load, the electric load that has been considered was for a small community. So the electrical load was around 1650 kilowatt hour per day, and the peak energy. So the life cycle assessment was done for 25 years, and the peak power considered was 225 kilowatt, while the average was something around 70 kilowatt. I considered the discount rate of 8%, and the inflation of 2% was considered per year. So this is basically, so we have four major components: the diesel genset, the solar PVs, the FESS, and the lithium-ion battery. So the major cost is involved with the FESS. That is something around $300,000, and that is US dollars. And the replacement cost has been considered to be 200,000. And the next major cost was contributed by the batteries. That was around 7,000 as a capital cost, and 70,000 as a capital cost, and the replacement cost also as 70,000. While the cost of the solar PVs and diesel genset were not considerable. The O&M cost was also not considerable, operation and maintenance cost. So, so the simulation was performed in the Homer Pro software, and we came up with three scenarios. So the best scenario came out to be the one that involved both the flywheels and the batteries. As you can see in the scenario number one, you can see that we have used a genset of 75 kilowatt, but as you can see, there were 6 lithium-ion batteries used. So the lithium-ion batteries were 100 kilowatt hour each, and the flywheel energy storage was 100 kilowatt each. So 6 batteries and 1 flywheel was used for the first scenario, and the net present cost for the 25 years was $3.45 million. And the cost, so the net present cost is basically the difference between all the costs that are involved during the whole life cycle minus the revenue if you generate any. And the cost of energy was $0.44 per kilowatt hour. In the second scenario, the batteries alone were considered, and you can see 19 batteries. The simulation resulted in 19 batteries, and in this scenario, no FESS was used. And as you can see, it was about $500,000 costly as compared to the scenario one. And of course, this indicates that the cost of energy per kilowatt hour would be more in the scenario two as compared to in the scenario one. The third scenario was considered, we didn't use any PV, any storage energy technology, we just used the genset. So we were basically dependent on just the diesel, the fossil fuel, right? So as you can see, it was more than $1 million, as compared to the scenario one, and the cost increased to $0.6 per kilowatt hour. I just want you to note that in case of scenario one, the frequency of 100% battery SOC was higher than the scenario two. It was 22% in scenario one and 13% in scenario one, which indicates that flywheel helped in basically. So as I initially mentioned, that we want eventually it decreases, the life of the batteries decreases, right? So basically in the scenario one, the flywheels help with the life of the batteries, because in most of the cases the battery storage was 100%. And if you compare between scenario one and the scenario three, in which the genset alone was considered, I noted that 50% of less carbon dioxide emissions were noted. If we just use the gensets, there will be 50% more carbon dioxide emissions as compared to the scenario number one. So to conclude, I'd like to mention that hybrid energy storage system was the best in the presented scenario, and the lesser hazardous waste was produced in the hybrid scenario, because lesser number of batteries were used, because it's chemical batteries and you have to dispose of the chemicals at the end. And eventually lesser greenhouse gas emissions were produced when renewable energies was incorporated in the system. That's it. Thank you all for listening to the presentation. And if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer those.
Thank you so much, Saad. I'm going to ask all of our 3 speakers to turn their cameras on. And now we are here to answer your questions, have a discussion. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. I just want to say one of the key things that I heard from all three of our speakers was that collaboration is key. Whether that's talking about collaboration between organizations within communities, but also collaboration between different technologies. Most effective technology applied many different strategies together. So that was one of the key takeaways that I heard. I'd love to hear from our three speakers. You all do research in different ways. Some of you slightly different, slightly closer in topics, but what were some of the key consistencies between your projects that you saw across those different areas, from the social, the technical? Neelakshi, do you want to start?
Absolutely. Thank you, Valerie. So very interesting presentations from Andrea and Mohammed. What I found very interesting was the sort of marriage of technology and society that is needed to sort of achieve a large-scale result. So, for example, technology like the flywheel presents this opportunity for us to decouple from existing grids and existing ways of how we produce and distribute energy. And what I understood or learned from Andrea's presentation was how community ownership or society sort of embracing that technology and owning it in a certain way and sort of rethinking our relationship with energy is equally important. So those were my two takeaways.
Andrea, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I would echo that for sure, Neelakshi. I think a consistency across all of our talks as well is this need to scale up. If we see a project in one community, it might only be a win for that community. And so how can we scale those benefits? And I think there is a real sense of unity that comes from when a network of communities come together to work on a project. I think of the Fort Chipewyan solar project. It was shared with me that that project is a collaboration between 3 nations, as well as a private actor, ATCO. I think it also speaks to the fact that if these private actors are serious about energy transition and making those commitments to climate change and to greenhouse gas reduction, we do need to see that kind of support for these projects. So scaling up.
Saad?
Yeah, so I just like to mention that we have pretty much good tools available that we can use to see if a particular system is feasible for the electrification. And as you can see that many communities are do want to go toward the sustainable options, and they want to incorporate the renewable energy sources. As Andrea showed, there are some communities that are already using solar panels on the individual basis. So we can always scale this up to the community side, and you can see that this is also becoming more economically feasible as well. As I mentioned that the solar PV is getting cheaper, so the cost to build solar PV plant is cheaper as compared to the fossil fuels, according to the International Energy Agency. So I think this is the way to go ahead.
Thank you, guys. And again, we are really talking about this from a social and technical, and I'm sure you've experienced being a researcher, there's often a barrier between those two groups. And here we have 3 of us, or 4 of us, talking about that technical and social side. How can we break down those barriers between those 2 groups? How can we communicate better? Do you have suggestions that communities can take to what questions to ask? How did they talk to people who have a completely different background than them? Andrea, do you want to start this time? Or it's Saad, go ahead.
Yeah, so as Neelakshi showed some of the surveys, but I'm pretty sure Neelakshi, of course, this was general public. She asked about the questions, but if she could, she would also have come to maybe contacted the engineering department and maybe keep the engineering department more engaging. So maybe there are some ideas that can be communicated within the 2 groups. So I would really appreciate if during the surveys or during the questionnaire sessions or during the interviews, maybe you, Andrea and Neelakshi, maybe you talk to the engineering guys as well, talk to the professors, talk to the students. You can always see, get the information from the Future Energy System website as well. So I think by this, maybe it can become a little bit more engaging, and maybe we can share some pretty good ideas with each other and build upon. Yeah.
Whoever wants to go next, Neelakshi, Andrea?
Yeah, I think the beauty of these community scale projects is that they do put communities in the driver's seat a little bit. So when you have a community champion or members of the community who are initiating their own projects, they're making those decisions as to where the project might locate, or any other of those important decisions. They are in that position of power, and those so-called technical experts, I think it levels the playing field a little bit when you realize that communities have a wealth of knowledge on these topics and on these projects, and that they know what they want. And these technical experts, I think, are keen to, some are keen to work in collaboration and to move forward in a new way, in a new relationship with communities in the energy sector. So, yeah.
Thank you. As the outreach and engagement coordinator for Future Energy Systems, I'm totally biased because my entire job is to try to break down those barriers and figure out how to communicate across those lines. Neelakshi, do you have anything you wanted to add?
So first of all, I acknowledge that those barriers exist still, but the good news is that those barriers are breaking more and more, both in terms of research, where we are going more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and also in terms of the nature of funding that's coming in. So Future Energy Systems itself is an example where you have multiple departments that are coming together and looking at different aspects. Also, I've noticed the trend in funding organizations which support such projects in communities are now looking at both the technical and the social component. So you would ultimately have a team of people working on it with different specialities. So I think the future for this area is bright, and I see it as a possibility that most of these silos will break down, and we will have more communicative research amongst each other.
Wonderful. So this is a question from our audience. It's primarily directed to Andrea and Neelakshi. I saw the map that Andrea shared. There's little community-led energy projects across the prairies. Can you speak about some of the potential reasons? Is there less individual interest? Are there policy barriers, other reasons? So I'd also love to hear from the technical side. Do you see potential technical reasons or economic from your research why there might be less projects across the prairies? So Andrea, it was on your presentation if you want to start.
Sure, yeah. Thank you for the question, Sheena. I think our energy system in the prairies is so centralized, and we've become so used to that. So I think part of it is not seeing the potential for these grassroots bottom-up projects to be initiated. But I think most of all, it's the policy environment, or I suppose the lack of a supportive policy environment. We saw a real uptake in these projects with the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan, the former NDP government. And then, of course, that plan was cut in the first UCP provincial budget, which also included the Indigenous Climate Leadership Program, the Community Solar Program, things of that nature. So absolutely, I think the province isn't having the conversation right now about energy transition, let alone these community level projects. So I do think the political environment is likely a key barrier.
Neelakshi?
So I kind of echo what Andrea says, and I think we must acknowledge that we are in this probably century of transition, whereas the last century was all about centralization and top down. Technology now is enabling us to decentralize, and I think society is responding very well to that. So the hope is that this century becomes the century of decentralization, of more community-led action and more community-led projects. So I think there's a temporal scale to it. I mean, it's an idea that is gaining momentum and would need some time before we see the results, because what we see as the dominant system has had probably 2 centuries to be the way it is now.
Saad, did you want to comment on the potential technical and economic issues that are resulting in less projects being seen in the prairies?
So I just want to mention that there's a project that came into, basically they contacted us. So there's this company called Future Forward. They are basically, so the work I mentioned, same kind of work they are trying to do is for a small community, for a small neighborhood in Nanaimo, in British Columbia. I don't know how to say that. It's Nanaimo, I think, yeah. So in British Columbia, so basically they are also trying to develop a sustainable community there. So I think the projects have started, and I see in the future that we'll be seeing more of these projects going on, and will eventually be transitioning to renewable energy. But the thing is, right now we are using very less amount of solar. We have a lot of potential in Saskatchewan, British Columbia, and Alberta. Saskatchewan, Ontario, and British Columbia. A lot of solar potential, but right now Canada is just used around the globe. We have around 627 gigawatt of solar power that is being used, and Canada is just produced using 1% of that. So, but these projects are a hope for the future, and we'll see more similar projects coming in.
Thank you so much. And Sheena, thank you for the question. Did you have anything you wanted to clarify with the presenters, or?
No, that's great. But I was also just interested. I had another question in the chat there about Andrea's question about how ATCO was being quite collaborative. And I've actually also had that experience, but other companies less so. Like there's lots of barriers to these projects created by the, crossing streets basically with EPCOR and things. And I was just, at the end of your presentation, you said something about how these larger energy companies will have to make commitments to adjust transition. And I was wondering if you had seen a lot of that kind of commitment and how they were defining just transition, because it isn't necessarily good for their bottom dollar. So I don't know about much of this, but I'm happy to hear if there is more of this going on.
Unfortunately, no, I don't think ATCO is coming to these projects with a commitment to energy justice. I don't think that's necessarily part of their language. And I can't speak to the the relationship that they developed with the communities on the Fort Chip project. But I think on one hand, communities are being realistic about the opportunities that are available, and sometimes that means a partnership with ATCO. Even though the project ultimately is still partly community owned. But on the other hand, to your other point of your question, I do think the scaling needs to happen without that private actor involvement as well. Say across Treaty 6 First Nations, Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations, if they were to get together. So coming together, creating that network of unity, I think is really powerful. With or without these private actors. But I do think in terms of, walking the talk, if these private actors are saying that they want to make climate commitments and if they want to reduce emissions, if that is part of their discourse, I think they need to be looking at supporting these kinds of projects as well.
One of the discussions we were having in our practices was, how do we change this from just checking a box that you have community involvement, you've talked to the community? How do we make this actually a community-based energy transition? Does anyone else want to add any comments to this discussion?
I can't help but say one more thing. Like, I don't know if people are aware, but the exhibition lands are probably going to be redeveloped, right? And the city doesn't have a plan to have any kind of district energy system or anything there. And I saw that as a failing of the project, but on the same hand, maybe it's an opportunity when I'm listening to you all speak that maybe the community itself could do that. Although I do think there are moments when communities can take this up, and then there are moments when there isn't actually a community around exhibition lands, and it would be better to have the city involved. And I would like to just see that happening, but it will go to council soon for a second hearing, I think, if anybody wants to show up and say they think there should be an energy transition project included.
Neelakshi, I thought I saw your mic go off earlier. Did you want to add anything before we move on?
No, just what you were mentioning, just going beyond ticking a box is sort of bringing this right in the beginning, bringing this right at the time of project conceptualization rather than an afterthought for both community-led, like from the social perspective as well and from the technical perspective as well. I think would go a long way given the lessons that we have learned from the first generation of such projects.
Awesome, thank you so much. We did get another question. They can see how solar would be quite easy for communities, but they're wondering, are there other forms of alternative energy, wind, biomass, etc., that could also be feasible for community-based ownerships? From what you guys have seen in other projects, from a technical, economic point of view, do you guys see things beyond just wind being possible for communities to work with? Whoever wants to take a stab first.
So I can go if that's all right. So speaking from an urban setting and from a neighborhood level, a lot depends on two things. One is the energy sources that are available. So in Edmonton, luckily, solar energy is a very good source. That 2,300 hours of sun in a year, so that makes sense. But it's a very valid question if that technology exists given the constraints put by an urban setting. So would geothermal be an alternative, or would a micro wind turbine be an alternative? I think it depends a lot, and then we would have to go to the engineering department for more insights. But just that there are certain constraints that are put by the urban setting that need to be taken into account, and how much space do people have, or neighborhood organizations have to install such energy generating sources.
I think that's hopefully going to be a huge area of research in the next few years, with goal 11 of the Sustainable Development Goals being sustainable cities and communities. We really do need to find technologies that work within an urban setting. Andrea, Saad, do you want to hop in?
Yeah, absolutely. So we see in Southern Alberta, given the potential for wind, we see I'm referencing specifically Indigenous owned projects, but Piikani First Nation has a wind turbine, community owned wind turbine, Weather Dancer. And we do see a lot of community owned hydro on the West Coast. That's a whole other, there's a lot of nuances to the feasibility of hydro and things of that nature, but I think it does obviously need to meet the context and the feasibility of the resource. So yeah, I think it is absolutely possible.
Yes, yeah, so related to the wind and the biomass, so we have in Canada pretty much high production using both, like as a whole for the grid, we use biomass and the wind energy. So for the highest we use is the hydro, then we use the biomass, and then we use the wind for the electricity generation. But in the perspective of individual communities, I'm not sure if that would be economically feasible. I can that's my thought. I haven't done research on that particularly because I am more focused towards solar PV. But what I think is that it would be may not be cost effective if we use, let's say, a wind just for a single community. But I'll leave it to the experts because since I haven't done any simulation with the wind, so I cannot basically comment on that clearly.
More research.
More research.
Anyone out there wants to do more research. So we're almost out of time. I'd love to end on a hopefully positive note. From your research, from this discussion we've had today, what's a message you want people to leave with, thinking about sustainability, energy in their communities? what's a positive message, an action that people can take in their own lives? Neelakshi, if you want to go first.
My message would be take control. It's now possible. The technology is there for it. The social networking is there for it. Take control.
Awesome. Saad?
Yeah, so the effort starts individually. So we'll have to start individually from our homes, and then of course we'll look into the broader picture, the communities. So first of all, of course, we have to implement the energy of the renewable energy resources for the communities, but you have to keep in mind that you have to save the energy as well. That's very much important. And then, we'll start putting an effort individually and then spread it throughout the community.
Bottom up. We're seeing that over and over, that we really need to start within our own homes, our own communities. Andrea?
Yeah, I would echo that. And I would say there's no singular focus for energy transition, but we need to think about these intersections of climate justice, energy justice, and think about who makes up our communities. And if we are serious about reconciliation as treaty peoples, that also means economic reconciliation and supporting Indigenous communities in their goals to be on equal footing in our transition.
Thank you all so much for your presentations. If anyone does have any additional questions, we will be sticking around for a few minutes after. So feel free to stick around, ask us anything. And I'm gonna pass it off to Sheena for closing remarks. But thank you, everyone. Check out Energy Systems, the Energy Systems website, and Future Energy Systems as well. Thank you, guys.
Yes, and on behalf of sustainability, I just want to thank all of the panelists and thank Valerie for moderating today, and thank everybody for coming and listening and being part of this really, really important conversation. Nath Walker has put in the chat a link where you can access other events coming up tomorrow. We're talking to the Intersections of Gender signature area at 11 in the morning, and at noon on Friday, we're talking to Precision Health. How does climate change impact your health? So that's an interesting one as well. So thanks to everyone. And in a week or two, you'll be able to find this video on our Green U of A YouTube site. And I also believe that we're going to be putting it up on the Future Energy Systems or the Energy Systems YouTube site. So you'll be able to find it in a couple of different places. And thank you again to everyone. And thank you to our panelists. Have a nice day, everyone. Yeah, virtual clapping.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
Great.
Thank you.